So what we're going to talk about tonight is fuel system safety, human factors. We've had some recent incidents in Arkansas, and this still is pretty much the #1 reason for engine failures and for forced landings in GA is either fuel exhaustion or fuel starvation. And that's because of a lot of different things, including some human factor stuff, mechanical. So we're going to talk about all that. We're going to talk about a couple of case studies that happened here locally in Arkansas. Can everybody read that? It seems a little blurry. I think it'll work. All right, so here's our overview. All right, we'll jump right into the common types of fuel systems. I just want to get a good foundation so you know what we're talking about. I'm not talking down to you folks. I know that most of y'all have used fuel systems and y'all are well aware, but let's go ahead and build that foundation up real quick before we go into the case studies. So a gravity feed system. This is typical in like a Cessna 172, right? The wings are full of fuel, and that's able to go down into the engine, common in high wing aircraft. Next would be the fuel pump system. This is more common in our low wings, right? So we have a fuel pump system that's pumping the fuel up to the engine, so there's no gravity feed. Both of these have different types of failures that could potentially happen, and some of them are in common as well. So mechanical failures on the gravity feed system. We've got the fuel tank vent blockage, right? How many of y'all keep a cover on the fuel tank vent on a 172? Show of hands, anybody? I don't see a lot of covers on those. Now typically it's on the left wing, right behind the strut. And I'm just talking about a 172, 150, the high wing Cessnas, this is all typical. At any rate, the caps are also vented. So most people, when I'm giving check rides, I ask about, well, do we have any backup vents or is that a single point of failure? Most of the fuel tanks caps themselves contain a vent as well, and that's kind of a backup, so that's good to know. Fuel contamination, of course, we have water, debris that could be in there. One thing to think about this is the design of the aircraft has there's a little bit of unusable fuel. So that unusable fuel is actually helping protect us because the debris and water tend to go down to that unusable space, and the fuel pickup isn't from the very bottom of the tank. So there's a little bit of a neat question that I asked during check rides of why do we have unusable fuel? And that's one of the reasons there. And then fuel siphoning. This is hard to see. This is if you don't have, I'm going to have a video of this here in a second. If you don't have a good seal on your fuel caps, you can actually have fuel siphoning. And that'll draw fuel out over the top of your wing. And on a high wing aircraft, that's very hard to detect because you can't see the top of your wing on, I don't think, any high wing, if everything's operating normally. So that's something to have a factor there. Human factors, improper fuel management, and skipping pre-flight checks. These are going to be the common between all types of fuel systems, right? All right, next we have, oh, that was loud. Next we have the fuel pump systems. So this would be your low wing aircraft. Now we typically on like a Piper, this is really common on a Piper, we have two types of fuel pumps. We have an electric driven fuel pump and we have an engine driven fuel pump. Now all GA aircraft that I'm aware of have an integral fuel pump attached to the engine. So it's in the accessory part of the engine, and it's always going to pump fuel, right? But then in a fuel pump system, you're going to have an electrically driven fuel pump that needs to be on in certain phases of flight in some cases. Now this is where training, we're going to talk about training later. Training is really important here because some of those fuel pumps you don't operate normally. They're only emergency pumps, and some that you do operate normally. I fly a wide variety of aircraft, and there's a lot of Piper twins, and I'm thinking of the Seneca specifically. The Seneca has a couple of extra fuel pumps that are red guarded switches. You don't use those unless you're having an emergency, and I've seen pilots take off with those normally, and they quickly return to the field because there's black smoke pouring out of the engines, and they think they're about to have an engine failure. And all they're doing is they're just flooding the engine with too much fuel because they're operating a fuel pump when they shouldn't be operating the fuel pump. So improper use of fuel pump, that's definitely a problem there. As far as the mechanical issues, you also have fuel siphoning and then the failure of a fuel pump. So if a lot of, like I was flying in a charity flight last weekend and flying a Cherokee 180. And I'd always take off and land with that fuel pump on. As soon as I was at cruise, turn the fuel pump off. You don't need it for straight and level flight, but for takeoff and landing, we want to leave it on in case we have a mechanical fuel pump failure that's there to back up. All right, human factors, incorrect use of pumps, like I already talked about, and then fuel siphoning. So let's take a look at this video here. This is in a Beechcraft Bonanza. So you see how much fuel is coming out of there? That's a fuel siphoning effect. And notice that the cap is still on, right? And this is even trickier. We'll talk about it in a second, but here's the aerodynamic forces of what's happening. And I stole this from the Beechcraft Pilot Proficiency Program. Tom Turner puts on a lesson about fuel systems. If you fly Bonanza aircraft and you haven't joined ABS, the American Bonanza Society, I would highly suggest that. And they have some really good online content, including a whole lesson on fuel systems. At any rate, this is the shape of the wing, right? We all know about the low pressure, high pressure. So that low pressure that sits on top of the wing creates a siphoning force. And if the fuel cap isn't on tight enough, it will actually draw fuel out of the tank. Now, this will cause a couple of different failures and could present itself in different failure modes. So this is a look at a Beechcraft wing, kind of a simple diagram here. And the red circle, that circle is around the fuel sender in a float. So most of the fuel senders, they're float type devices. So it's a sealed piece of plastic that sits on top of the fuel. So there's more fuel, it floats on top of the fuel and indicates a higher level on the fuel quantity gauge. If it's less fuel, it goes down, right? So as you can see here, it's in a normal operation. However, right here, if we see during fuel siphoning, the same suction force that's causing the fuel to leave the fuel tank is also causing that fuel float to rise to the top of the tank. So you can see that the fuel sending float is no longer on top of the fuel. It's actually being sucked up to the top of the tank. So the way that this would present itself in the aircraft is you would have an unusually high amount of fuel indicated in that fuel tank. So not only are you siphoning fuel, you've got a fuel leak. You don't have any indication of that in the cockpit. In fact, you have the opposite indication. It looks like you're getting more fuel. So and we'll talk about this, I guess we'll talk about it now. With human factors being an issue here, a critical issue with fuel management is if you're flying an aircraft and you have unusual indications, and that means either an unusual high amount of fuel or an unusual low amount of fuel, both of those are cause for concern, right? And thinking rationally, yeah, it might be great to assume, oh wow, I'm making fuel. Like, this is great. I've got more fuel than I started out with. What a great day. But yeah, think about that rationally. That's impossible unless you're hitting the tanker, which I'm going to assume you're not doing in a Cessna 172 or an A36. So if you see any abnormal indications, that's an issue, right, that you need to check out. I fly a lot of Bonanza aircraft. I always carry a light with me when I'm flying at night because every once in a while I'll just take the light, shine it out the window, and look at my wing just to see if I'm siphoning fuel, see any other stuff that you can't normally see during the day. Thankfully, when we're flying a low-wing aircraft, this would be really obvious. As long as you're looking outside, you can see, oh, I'm siphoning fuel. I need to land immediately. I would probably also select an opposite fuel tank. So if I'm siphoning fuel from the right tank, well, let's select the left tank and not select the one we're losing fuel out of. Now, I have had a fuel siphoning issue, and this is just a personal anecdote story. We had a 182 that had new fuel caps, and they were supposed to be extra aerodynamic, and they were just better. Of course, they cost a lot of money, and it was an STC, and then had been in the shop for like a month getting these new fuel caps installed. So they got the new fuel caps installed, and they're like, Seth, you need to go, fly the airplane down southern Arkansas. First flight with these things on there. So I take off. About 30 minutes into the flight, I noticed that my right fuel gauge had dropped significantly. I took off a full tank, so it was 84 gallons usable fuel in a 182. And I shouldn't have half tank, right? these fuel gauges are pretty reliable. And we'll talk about fuel gauges in a little bit. But I look out there, I don't see anything, and I look behind the aircraft and I can see this stream of fuel. And I've been siphoning fuel out of that tank for about 30 minutes out of that right wing. And I wound up losing around 15 gallons of fuel out of that right wing, and just not long. I don't know exactly how long it was. Anyway, it landed. Turns out that fuel cap, it looked like it was seated, but since that was new equipment to me, it wasn't seated properly. So it took me 2 more attempts to get that thing seated where it wasn't siphoning fuel. So siphoning fuel in a high wing aircraft, big deal. Yeah, and that's a good point. On the aircraft, you will get some blue staining. If you had siphoning happen when you land, you'll see that. So if you're flying a high wing and you get lucky and you don't run out of fuel and you land, at your next fuel stop, you're up on top of the wing and you notice blue streaking, you've been siphoning fuel, right? And that leads straight into our next topic, which is fuel tanks. So there's 2 main types of fuel tanks in general aviation aircraft. There's an integral tank and there's a bladder tank. Let's talk about the bladder tank first. First of all, why we use bladders is it's a flexible material and it can conform to different shapes of wings, and we don't have to make the wings fuel tight, essentially. That's a good thing. So we can make a bladder, but that's going to add weight, and it also adds some types of failure modes. And what I mean by that is, imagine you've got this bladder sitting in your wing. If it loses its shape, it's not going to hold the same amount of fuel. Right? If you take an aluminum can and you crush it, you can't put as much fluid in that can anymore because it's crushed. So they usually put some sort of fasteners that fasten this bladder to conform to the inside of your wing. Well, during a siphoning incident or siphoning event, it draws a suction onto the tank, and it can cause those bladders to collapse. And it can either fully collapse or partially collapse, and it may go unnoticed. And the way it would go unnoticed is you go to your next fuel stop and you fill up the tank, and if you're not careful about keeping your fuel log and knowing how much fuel you should put in there, all you're going to see is that the tank's full, right? We fill it up until some of it spills out over the wing usually when I'm refueling, and the fuel pops out of the top. We're like, okay, tanks are full. Well, if that's a 20-gallon tank that has experienced a siphoning event and part of the tank has collapsed, it might only be a 15-gallon tank now, maybe only a 10-gallon, maybe only a 5-gallon tank. You don't really know. It depends on how that bladder has failed. So for bladder tanks, the flexible bags inside the wing, that's what we have on a lot of GA aircraft. And then the next one is the wet wing. So the wet wing, these are sealed portions of the wing structure. So this is an actual wet wing. I believe the Mooney has a wet wing. That's probably one of the most common. You're a Mooney guy. They have that, right? So a lot less, I guess they could collapse, right? But then you've got a bigger issue. Your wing has collapsed if your fuel tank has collapsed. So you probably noticed that. But they have another issue of they can actually leak maybe a little bit easier, because now the structure of the wing itself has to be sealed in a way that the fuel is not able to leak out. So usually there's some sort of sealant material that's glued or painted on the seams of the wings. So you can imagine kind of the inside of the wing with all the ribs and aluminum and stuff. So that can degrade over time and cause fuel leaks. So since Mooney is real common here, it's really important to do an under the wing inspection. So when you're pre-flighting the airplane, getting on your hands and knees, getting your hands and knees a little dirty, looking under the aircraft to see any blue streaking under the wing, that could be indicative. You're going to see that blue streaking, and that could be indicative of a fuel leak, or it is. One of the reasons why we have that blue dye in aviation grade fuel is to help us identify leaks, actually. And I've had it help me on a couple of different instances. One time on an engine of a Seneca, we popped the cowl on the engine of the Seneca, and I noticed around the intake tubes there was a lot of blue streaking. So that was indicative of, hey, we've got an intake leak here. And the fuel air mixture going into the engine is actually getting blown out onto the outside of the engine. We've got a fuel leak there. And then several times on the lower portion of the wing or the upper portion of the wing, you'll see the blue streaking. I was just doing a check ride probably 2 months ago, and a gentleman showed up with a 172. We go out and do the pre-flight, and the right-hand side of the plane, there's just blue dye. It looked like he murdered a Smurf on the outside of the plane. And I was like, what's the issue here? And he's like, oh, the mechanic told me not to worry about it. That's a normal leak. No, it's not a normal leak. All right, these save weight capacity. Obviously, we don't have that bladder in there, so there are some upsides there. So bladder tank failure modes. You lose shape or collapse and may cause inaccurate fuel readings. So remember those fuel floats we were talking about? Again, if the bottom, depending on how the failure happens of the fasteners, I've seen it to where the bladders have actually pushed up on the fuel sending units, or they keep the sending unit from going all the way to the bottom of the tank. So what could be happening is that fuel sending unit is telling you have half tanks, when really it's just, there's an obstruction in the fuel bladder itself from reaching the bottom of the tank, so it can't tell you the true amount of fuel anymore. So that would cause your inaccurate fuel readings. All right, detection and prevention. The main thing is we have to track our fuel usage, and this is what I see a lot of pilots not doing. And this isn't one of my official NTSB case studies, but there was a recent event with a plane that I'm very familiar with. It's a Beechcraft Travel Air, and it has main tanks and aux tanks. It's a 4-position switch, and you can either go main, aux, crossfeed, or off. Those are your 4 options. Well, the POH says you need to take off and land in the mains, and when you're cruising straight and level flight, you can burn off the auxes. So it's typical, you have it straightforward for the mains, you take off, as soon as you level off, you select the auxes and you burn out of the auxes. When you land, you take it back to the mains. So this plane had been flying several iterations where the pilot thought he was doing this. But because of some poor maintenance along the line, we don't exactly know where this happened, that fuel selector was no longer working. Meaning when he would select aux tank, he wasn't selecting aux tank. He was still burning out of the main. And then he would go and select the main and land. And luckily, all of his flights were within the range of the fuel capacity of the main tanks only. Well, as luck would have it, or unluckiness would have it, he's flying and he flies beyond the range of the main tanks. So he experiences a fuel starvation event, not exhaustion. Right? Exhaustion is when you totally run out of fuel in the whole airplane. Starvation just means there's fuel on the airplane, it's just not getting to the engine. So he had a fuel starvation event in, I think it was the left engine first. So he selected what he thought was another tank, and the whole time he wasn't doing anything. All that he was doing is burning off the mains. The other engine quickly experienced fuel starvation, so now he has a dual engine failure in a twin, something that is not very common at all. We don't really practice for. Luckily, there was a really high SA pilot in the air nearby that said, hey, to your 10 o'clock, there's a grass strip. Talked his eyes to this grass strip. He's able to put it down. They got gas back in the plane, flew it out shortly thereafter, after discovering the problem with the fuel selectors themselves. So it's kind of a crazy story. It happened here in Arkansas not too long ago. But how could this pilot have avoided this, right? It was a mechanical failure. We know that those fuel selectors weren't operating correctly. Well, the pilot also wasn't overseeing, and I don't think he was the pilot each flight, but whoever was flying the plane wasn't overseeing the refueling. They were just paying the bill. Hey, top it off. Go inside, have a cup of coffee. Who's done that? I've done that. I'll raise my hand. I've done it. Several times I've asked a lineman that I don't know from Adam. Not you, Adam. Adam, I don't know. I've asked the lineman to refill the plane, and I don't oversee it. Now, I'm pretty good about looking at the fuel receipt and making sure that around about the amount of fuel I thought was going to go in the plane went in the plane. And we kind of know that just for how much it hurts whenever we swipe the credit card anyway. So that's what this pilot was doing, and the plane wasn't using more fuel than normal. It was just only using the fuel out of one tank, and the line guy wasn't saying, hey, I put 40 gallons in the mains. He was just saying, oh, I put 40 gallons in there. And the pilot was completely unaware that he was came within 5 gallons of running out of fuel on a couple of those refuels. If he would have gotten out and checked, the auxes were full the whole time. The auxes never burned down. So he could have caught that. It was a preventable incident in that if he would have checked after each flight, hey, I have burned fuel out of the auxes. That would have been able to see that. The other thing, that there's a human factor issue with this incident specifically, is that this was an older 50s model Travelair. So it only has 2 fuel gauges. It has 4 tanks. It only has 2 gauges. And those gauges on most of the Travelairs are not correlated with the tank selector. But in another aircraft that this pilot flew, they are. So in a Cessna 310, when you move the fuel selector, the fuel gauges automatically show what the selector's pointing at. In the Travelair, they do not. You have to switch the fuel selector and switch the fuel tank. So that right there is another human factors issue where we've got a negative transfer. The majority of the twin time that this pilot was flying was in a different type that operated similar, but fundamentally different. So that's a little anecdote there. All right, wet wing failure modes. We got sealant degradation. We can have structural cracks. Hopefully, structural cracks, that means your airframe is cracked. So you've got a bigger issue there. So we need to visually inspect for leaks, and then the structural monitoring. With the advent of borescope cameras, or just cameras in general that are easy to get into hard spaces, it's, of course, talk with a knowledgeable AMT about how you safely put an electronic device in a fuel tank. Don't go do this yourself. But it's much easier to go in and inspect the fuel bladder or a wet wing to see if there's any deformations or anything that needs to be addressed. All right, fuel gauge. Let's talk about fuel gauges. Common misconception. Who's heard that fuel gauges only need to be accurate when they're empty? I've heard it. I heard it for a long time. That's just not the case. So gauges, they have to be accurate throughout the entire range of the fuel tanks. And we could go down the rabbit hole about the Part 23 certification and how that changed. And I think 2017 is when the old rules went away. But really 91205, or that dreaded tomato flames acronym I hate. But the 91205 says the fuel gauge indicating the quantity of fuel in each tank. That's pretty black and white. The fuel gauge has to identify the quantity in that tank. 91205 doesn't say identify when the tank is empty. It says identify the quantity. So the fuel gauges have to work. If your fuel gauges aren't working properly, and you know who you are, I know you, I've flown airplanes where I'm like, there's no way this gauge is working right. But yeah, if your gauges aren't working right, the FAA is laughing at me, that's great. But yeah, if they're not working right, have that addressed. Figure out why. Do you have a bad fuel sending unit? There's companies that overhaul sending units. You can have new gauges installed. Just try to track down what's wrong with your fuel quantity indicator. But don't just accept. This myth, I think, makes people take fuel quantity gauges less seriously. If they don't work, they're like, oh, it only has to be accurate when it's empty anyway. I've heard that exact line from many pilots. And it's just like, well, we're just accepting that fuel gauges don't work. And yeah, in a 40, 50, 80-year-old airplane, maybe they need to be looked at, right? All right, accurate fuel gauges. So obviously, this can really help prevent fuel starvation events. And we can see that by general aviation has gotten safer as time has gone on. Part of it is I think we have better training, despite what some people think. I really do think the training has gotten better. The other thing is mechanically, the planes have gotten better, just with the advent of technology. So you can go out and fly an older 50s, 60s model 172 that has really bad fuel gauges. I call them low resolution displays because they're about 1.5 inches wide. And that 1.5 inches is showing me the difference between, 0 gallons and 20 gallons. Versus I fly a newer 172 G1000 high resolution display is very accurate, and it also has lights. So at a certain point, I'll get a fuel low light. I should have looked this up. Now I just remembered it, but there was a statistic that I've seen recently of the number of fuel starvation and fuel exhaustion events that have happened in old Cessnas versus the new Cessnas that have a low fuel light. And it was a drastic difference, as you can imagine. A lot less likely to have a fuel starvation incident when you have a light that comes on that you can't turn off, that's blaring you in the face saying low fuel when you get down to about 30 minutes of usable fuel. That's a really important safety feature. And that's also in the SR-22, the Cirrus, the SR-20. I think all new build GA aircraft have some sort of fuel low light that will come on in addition to those fuel gauges. So your responsibility is to keep track of those fuel gauges and make sure that it makes sense, right? We probably get a little lazy after we get our private pilot and our commercial pilot about keeping fuel logs. That may become a lot more important as you go on in your career. If you're going to go fly for the airlines, for instance, myself, I just did an ETOPS flight to Hawaii. And during that flight, about every 15 minutes, we're really looking at our fuel down to the 1/10 of the pound to make sure we have as much fuel as we thought we would have. And we're keeping a very close track of our fuel log. One, to make sure, obviously, we're going to make it to our destination safely. The second reason is I fly for Southwest, like I said. Both Southwest and I think Delta have had recent incidents where there was a fuel leak discovered. So we have a point at our route of flight called the equal time point, and that's kind of, okay, do we have to turn around and divert back to San Francisco, or can we continue on to the islands? And in both of those instances, especially ours, we got really close to that equal time point and then discovered we've got a fuel leak. And this, I say we as in the company, it wasn't me, thankfully. But they got near that ETP, realized they have a fuel leak, and the reason they were able to identify that fuel leak is because they were keeping very close track of their fuel quantity gauges. Now, it's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison, saying of the type of fuel gauges we have in a 737 versus what you have on a 172. But I use that to illustrate the point that monitoring your fuel gauges and having that expected amount in there based on what those readings are is really important. And I think that, again, that gets overlooked because of this myth that the fuel gauges aren't accurate anyway unless they're empty. All right, fuel selectors. This is a big one. And there's some human factors folks here from the FAA. Y'all like general human factors or specifically? Yeah. Human factors fascinates me because, again, I'm in a lot of different aircraft. And in older aircraft, the way they look was really important, right? You have to fly an old H-35 Bonanza that has the piano keys, and man, it's Art Deco beautiful. But the gear switch looks identical to the landing lights. It looks great. It's a human factors nightmare. And then you get an SR-22, a Gen 6 SR-22 is like a human factors miracle. It's like, I sit in that thing and just everything's where it's supposed to be. It's the easiest plane to fly, I think. And it's because they've put a lot of thought into human factors. Oddly enough, Cessna in their 300 and 400 series twins didn't put much thought into human factors. And I feel like the way I feel flying a 400 series Cessna single pilot IFR is like those guys in New York, the one-man band guys, you know, that like have the drum and the horn and they're trying to do everything. That's what I feel like flying a 400 series Cessna, because it's a human factors nightmare. I got switches over here I can barely reach with the shoulder harness on that are really important. They're fuel related. So to top it all off, there's no standardization in fuel selectors. And so I was thinking, you know, what's a good analogy here? And I'm in a lot of hotels, and I ran into this last week on a Southwest trip. This is like your familiar control, right? If I tell you to go operate a shower and you see this is easy, right? I know everybody knows how this works. This is standard equipment in like 90% of hotels. We stay in a nice hotel, and this is what's in the bathroom. It took me like 20 minutes to figure out how to take a shower with this thing. Because, yeah, it looks great. It's really cool, futuristic looking. I have no idea like how to operate this thing without getting some training on it or with some trial and error. And so that's a great analogy, because that's exactly how I feel when I see this in a Cessna. I'm like, okay, both. Easy, right? Pre-flight, both, done. Now, as an instructor, I was thinking about this. There's something called the law of primacy. So the law of primacy just basically says the first way you learn something is kind of the first impressions rule, right? The first impressions really matter. Law of primacy, same thing. The first thing you learn is what's the most indelible. So we have all these pilots that are learning on this fuel selector right here, both. It's the easy button, both. They're not even thinking about switching tanks. So then they go to fly something like this. Now, this is from a Bonanza. We're actually going to talk about one of our case studies from an M35 Bonanza that has a fuel selector like this. Now, basically it's the same, right? I'm selecting different tanks with it. I have a couple different options here. I have a left and a right. I have some instructions on there. It's kind of worn off. If you look in the pilot operating handbook, it says, hey, that's a required placard. I don't know if the FAA would be okay with that, because you can't really read it, but anyway, it's telling us that, hey, we have to use the left main first, and then we can use the right. The first hour, we need to use the left main because any extra fuel goes back into the left main that we don't burn. So if we start out with the right tank, we'll be dumping fuel overboard. So obviously, already I'm at the point where we don't have the easy button. This takes a little bit of training to use properly, and you're going to have to actively manipulate it during flight. But the pilots that are flying this learned in a 172 that have the fuel selector both. So that's one of the things that's different. The other thing you may not have caught on, but look at the shape of that handle. So the 172 has the long piece of the handle points to the tank that you have selected. The long one is opposite of the tank that you have selected. So even from a human factor standpoint, there's no standardization in how these fuel selector works. And this is actually the second anecdote I'll share with you. And the reason the Travel Air and the Twin Navion I'm fixing to talk about, I don't have the NTSB stuff for. The preliminary is all that's out there. So this is all just anecdotal evidence for me. I've got final reports for 2 other fatal accidents. The 2 that I'm sharing with you now were non-fatal, but they happened in this state, and they happened in the past year, within the past 12 months. So the Twin Navion, the reason that happened is because of this. The long handle, the pilot thought the long part of the handle was pointed at the tank he has selected. And it wasn't. It was opposite. There was a tiny arrow on the other end of the handle, like right here. So when he thought he was on the main tanks, he was actually on the auxiliary tanks. And the auxiliary tanks are much smaller. And it's a similar story to the Travel Air story, is he just had gotten lucky. for several flights, he had been burning off of the oxes and nothing bad had happened. And then one day he flew a little bit longer than he normally flew, and he starved those fuel tanks of fuel and had a fuel starvation incident. So he had fuel on the airplane, he just had the selector in the wrong position. And the reason he had the fuel selector in the wrong position is he was misunderstanding what that fuel selector was doing. So he was having the same problem I was having when I was trying to take a shower last week, but the consequences were a lot higher than just getting burned. Luckily, serious injuries, but he was able to, he and his passengers were able to make it out. So these are some examples of some unfamiliar controls. You can tell the one up to the top right, that plane, that's from an NTSB docket. So that was a fatal accident. And you can tell there, I've got two sets of pumps, right? We talked about a fuel pump system. We have aux pumps, but then we also have fuel transfer pumps. So flying more complex planes, specifically twins, but there are some singles that have this. The picture on the top left there, that's from a Beechcraft. That's a DeShannon tip tank mod that's very common on Beechcraft. So if I have an aftermarket DeShannon tip tank on a M35 Bonanza, my engine can't feed directly from those tip tanks. All I can do is transfer the tip tanks into the main tanks. So now I have to burn the main tanks down for an hour or two, and then turn my transfer pumps on to fill those tanks back up. And it's not uncommon to have 1 or 2 fuel gauges on the plane and have 7 tanks of fuel. I've got 1 fuel gauge and 7 tanks. That starts sounding like that one-man band, right? You're doing a lot of stuff, a lot of tracking to keep track of this. And I think this played a direct role in one of the case studies that we're about to talk about. The lower one, this is from a Cessna 310. So this played, I think, a role in our travel air story where everything turned out great. But those tanks, as I switch those fuel selectors, they automatically make my fuel gauges switch and read what's in that tank. That's unlike the other planes. All right, so we're going to talk about some case studies here, but pilots selecting the wrong tank. Fuel starvation is just, hey, there's fuel on board and we can't get to it. The key here is thorough training in that aircraft. You need to get thorough training from an instructor that's familiar with that airplane. Because the way the FARs are worded, and the way we can use those is, I can go out, hey, my CFI buddy that I get all my checkouts from, he's got a couple hours in this plane, so he can give me a sign-off, and he's good to go. Well, the problem is, if that CFI buddy of yours has only operated that plane in the pattern doing checkouts, he probably hasn't used the fuel system that much. Right? There was I used to have a multi-engine course in Russellville. People would come from all over the country to learn how to fly multis, and we flew travel airs. And a guy had heard about us through the American Bonanza Society, and he had flown his M35 Bonanza from Washington State to Russellville, Arkansas in one leg. He had 2 oxygen bottles with him. He had 12 tanks. He did air racing. So he had STC for, I think, 12 tanks. And he landed with an hour and a half of fuel. He knew that plane. He knew that fuel system inside and out because he had done long endurance air racing with it. And we're not talking about like the Reno air races. We're talking about like the poker run type air race where if you can overfly a couple airports, you're going to win because you don't have to waste time stopping and getting fuel. So this guy knew his airplane really well and knew that fuel system. I'd feel really confident saying, hey, I need you to go give a sign-off for somebody how to fly an M35 Bonanza, which is just a high-performance complex airplane. Versus finding a local CFI that has never taken a cross-country in that plane. He's high-performance complex rated. He's able to give you the endorsement. He signs you off to go fly M35 Bonanza, and you don't know the intricacies of that fuel system because your sign-off involved you maybe going up for 30 minutes or an hour, maybe doing a manual gear extension. Learning, oh yeah, don't pull the engine back too much or you'll damage it, but not a lot of talk about how to operate the fuel system. So that's really important. All right, fuel exhaustion. We're going to look at a fatal case study here that happened in Arkansas, but that's where it's poor fuel planning. I almost picked one. It was from the early 2000s. It was a Cessna 177 Cardinal taken off out of Hope. Took off out of Hope and was going to land at one of the grass strips over by Fort Smith around the Paris area. There's two out there. I don't know which one he was landing at, and apparently he didn't either, because he took off from Hope, orbited for an hour and a half looking for this place, couldn't find it, made a precautionary landing in a farmer's field. This is all in the NTSB report. Made a precautionary landing, got 5 gallons of fuel, took off again, orbited for 45 minutes, ran out of fuel and crashed. Never found the grass strip, but he landed twice. So yeah, that would be a case of fuel starvation. And that's normally either poor planning or maybe a little bit of both. So let's think about this guy. This guy is trying to find this grass strip, right? He's got a mission. He's got a pressure to perform. He thinks, well, I did the right thing. I landed and I got some extra fuel. Surely I can find this place. We've heard it where somebody lands. Man, this almost happened to me. And this is why I like to land with an hour worth of gas. I always like to land with an hour worth of gas, and especially a single engine airplane, especially at night. Man, as much gas but never less than an hour. So we're flying back after a long day in a SR-22. I was flying a Part 91 contract job for a law firm. And we had been up in Indiana, and we were coming back, and there were tornadoes everywhere. Just this line of storms that had popped up in the summer. And so I wound up having to fly all the way down almost to northern Georgia, trying to get around this line of thunderstorms. So my fuel planning, the plan that I had at the beginning of the day was not at all what we flew. So we had diverted into a place in western Tennessee, gotten some fuel, gotten something to eat, and we were making our last leg home. And I just wasn't feeling comfortable with the amount of fuel I was going to land with. And so I wanted to make an extra fuel stop. This is an unplanned fuel stop, just precautionary. So I land at West Memphis. And when we land at West Memphis, we go to get gas in the plane, and the pumps are inoperative. There's no NOTAM. There's no sign that they just don't work. We tried to call people. Nobody was there. So that right there is like the beginning of an incident docket, right? Because if I hadn't planned to land with an hour worth of fuel, I had enough to take off, and we could go to another airport and get gas. But there's been a couple of accident studies where I've seen a pilot land, the fuel pump doesn't work, or they're out of fuel, or he thought there was fuel there and there wasn't. And he's like, well, I'll just go to the next airport. And he goes to the next airport and runs out of gas on the way. That's a real common kind of mode of fuel starvation there. All right, mismanagement of the fuel system controls, inadequate pre-flight planning, distraction, task overload, lack of system understanding. That's kind of all the things we've just talked about of the human factors that lead to this. Most of the time, it's human factors. And I would even argue when it's a mechanical failure, there's probably a component of human factors in there as well. Because we should be able to, if we have good human factors, if we're being the pilots we should be able to safely overcome any adversity given to us by the plane for a mechanical failure. That was kind of wordy, but basically, other than the wing coming off in flight, you as the PIC should be able to handle that, right? If your fuel pump fails, we've got a mechanical fuel pump, right? Or if your mechanical fuel pump fails, you've got an electric fuel pump. If your right tank collapses and you have fuel starvation, you should be able to select the left tank, and there should be fuel in that tank for you to make a precautionary landing and have a good outcome. So just because there's a mechanical failure doesn't basically give you the right to have a human factors failure. But this is just the nature of complacency. And this is what I tell everyone to say during an interview when they ask you the question of what's your biggest weakness as a pilot? My favorite answer to that is overcoming complacency. Because that's the truth. I don't care how many hours you have, complacency is a big thing that you're going to have to overcome. And it really hurts us higher time pilots. You know, there's that killing zone we talk about when a pilot gets around 300 to 400 hours. They can get really complacent right there. And they don't have enough wisdom to overcome that complacency. But every time you see an accident study with somebody that has 10,000 hours or 15,000 hours, there was probably a component of complacency involved in that accident. All right. This is a friend of mine. I gave him 2 check rides. Unfortunately, he passed away in a fuel starvation accident in Fayetteville. Brant Barnes is his name. He's holding up a piece of pizza because he owned about 16 Papa John's franchises. He owned a SR-22. You can see that's what he's in right there. He didn't die in an SR-22, though. He died in an M35 Bonanza. He had about 2,000 hours in that SR-22. I did his check ride in that airplane, his commercial single-engine add-on. Shortly thereafter, we did his multi-engine add-on in a Beechcraft Travel Air. That was the first time he had flown a Beechcraft product. And about 2 years later, his SR-22 was down for maintenance, and he borrowed a friend's M35 Bonanza. So, there's something interesting here. This is just an anecdote. This isn't the accident. Brant was in 2 accidents. His last one was as fatal. The first one was in the yard of my childhood home. This yard right here is where I lived for about 8 years as a kid going to high school. I used to ride my bike right down that road. That's my neighbor's house right there. This is in 2013. Catastrophic engine failure. Brant handled it great. He glided the plane in 15 miles away. This is one of the only straight, flat roads in the area. And I know that area really well. This is at the base of the Ozarks. So he glided over National Forest, put it down, walked away. Did a great job. Brant was a good pilot. This is the M35 accident in 2023. He was on his way back from Stuttgart into Fayetteville. And here's the case study. There's the case study number. If y'all want to jot that down, y'all can read about it. You can pull up the NTSB docket, see all the pictures and everything. Rather than just sit here and recite it for you, I'll let you read that. So essentially, he took off on the mains, on the left main, as you're supposed to in the M35 to burn some fuel off. Then he selected the auxes. Then he reselected the auxes and basically starved them of fuel. In the accident, they found the fuel selector switch on, I believe, the right tank. They were thinking maybe he had chosen the left or the right trying to get fuel. I think there was more going on here because, remember I said Brant had 2,000 hours in an SR-22. The fuel selector switch in the SR-22, remember, the SR-22 is a human factors. It's a good human. I lost my words there. It's a human factors dream. It's perfect, I think. It's one of the closest perfect aircraft to human factors. The fuel selector is right there by your hand. You got the throttle, mixture, fuel selector, all right there. The fuel selector in N35 is a left-hand fuel selector, and it's down under your left knee. And if you're a bigger guy, it's kind of hard to get to. At night, when this occurred, it's very hard to see. I would argue that it's probably impossible to see, especially when things aren't going well. And there's another thing that can happen in a Bonanza, and that's called fuel unporting. So when you pitch the plane down, you uncover the fuel pickup line, and the engine can lose power due to loss of fuel flow to the engine because you just kind of slosh the fuel over. Depending on your power setting too, there's an added human factor potential here of you may not notice that you've had an engine failure. which some people look at me and think I'm crazy when I say that, but I really do think that there's a lot of pilots that have engine failures in the descent that don't know they have an engine failure, because an idling engine doesn't sound any different than a dead engine. It really doesn't. Now, if you go from 20 inches of manifold or 25 inches of manifold pressure to a dead engine, of course you'll notice that. That's a huge change. But if you're in an idle descent and you lose the engine, there's a good chance you won't know it. Until you try to level off or arrest the descent and you add power and the throttle doesn't cause a response from the engine. I'm not saying that that's what happened with Brad, but he was in the descent when this happened, because he had been flying and started the descent talking to ATC without any reported problems. So we know that this problem happened in the descent, and we know from a post-accident investigation that the auxiliary tanks were empty. So based on the information that we have, he experienced a fuel starvation event, tried to dead stick it at night, and ran out of energy and put it down too hard to survive the accident. You can tell from the crash, it's not like just a crater. So this is not a low energy impact, but it's also not an incredibly high energy impact, right? All the big pieces are there. This wasn't an in-flight breakup. So I think he was doing his best to do a dead stick landing, but if you've ever been to Fayetteville, that's a really hard place to do a dead stick at night with no lights. It's really difficult. Also really difficult to experience that type of failure in a plane that you have very little hours in. And the NTSB docket didn't really dive into Brant's hours of training in the M35 Bonanza, but just based on what I saw of his logbook and my personal experience knowing that he owned an SR-22, I don't think he had more than 50 hours in this plane, if that. And I would argue that that's probably on the lower end, especially if you were using it for short flights. He didn't really know that fuel system. All right, here's one from 2013. There's a docket number. This is what's left of a King Air 90, and this is in Springdale, Arkansas. So here's the case study of that. So about 1 quart of fuel was observed in each fuel tank. No evidence of fuel spillage was found on the ground. No fuel stains were observed on the underside of the wing panels, wing trailing edges, or engine nacelles. No fuel smell was observed at the accident site. However, the fuel totalizer showed 123 gallons of fuel was remaining. So that's interesting. Magnification of the annunciator panel light bulb revealed that the left main and right low fuel pressure annunciator lights were illuminated at the time of impact. At the examination of the airframe, the engines revealed no anomalies would have produced normal operation. So basically there's nothing wrong with the engines. And the low fuel lights were on when it impacted. I was flying a friend's seaplane last week, has a fuel totalizer, and we topped it off, and I was taking it out to get the splash and goes, fun time, right? I fly it down, do my splashes, I'm flying back, and I noticed the fuel totalizer is flashing at me. And it says I've got 1 gallon of fuel remaining. And the fuel gauges in this plane are little tubes. So it's a cub, it's on either side. So I look up at these tubes, and I'm like, I think there's half, but this fuel totalizer is wrong. And I realized that I had a human factors failure. This was last week, and this is a true story. You can ask him, because it's his airplane. So I went ahead and diverted over to an airport I wasn't planning going to, and I landed, and I topped it off, and I reset the fuel totalizer, and I reminded myself that complacency kills. And that's exactly what they think happened here, is a lot of fuel totalizers, especially aftermarket fuel totalizers, you can reset as a pilot inadvertently. You can set them wrong. And in other words, they're not integral to the aircraft. They're not tied into the fuel tanks. They only know how much fuel you're using in some instances. Sometimes it's just a programmed set amount, depending on the type of fuel totalizer. So in this case of the King Air, it was independent of the fuel tanks. So the fuel totalizer wasn't tied into the fuel quantity gauge, but it was tied into the fuel flow. So there was a fuel flow meter. So the totalizers knew how much fuel you were burning, but they only knew how much fuel was in the plane based on what you told it at the beginning of the flight. So what the NTSB speculates here is that the pilot was trusting the fuel totalizer more than the fuel quantity gauge. Remember, we talked about how nobody trusts fuel quantity gauges because of this old wives' tale that they're never correct unless they're read empty. In this case, all information points to the fact that they were in fact reading empty at the time of the crash here. But this is really interesting to think about how the fuel totalizers, they can work against us. So knowing that is a critical piece of training. If you're flying an aircraft with a fuel totalizer, work that into your checklist, because a lot of the fuel totalizers that are aftermarket, maybe they don't exist on the normal checklist. So I've got a lot of C90 time, and nowhere in the C90 normal operating checklist is there any mention about resetting a fuel totalizer, at least on the 90s that I've flown. So if you're flying an aircraft that has a fuel totalizer, maybe it's time to pencil in, in the Air Force, before we had digital checklists, we would have write-in changes. So we would show up and stand about and be like, hey, there's a new write-in change. You're going to write the, check fuel totalizer between steps 4 and 5 of the before takeoff checklist. And we'd have to write those in, and then if you don't have it in your check ride, you have a bad day. But there's no oversight like that for us GA folks. So if you're out there flying an aircraft that has a system that has been installed with good intentions, right? I go out and spend money on a fuel totalizer to try to increase safety, not decrease it. But unless you integrate that into how you're operating the aircraft, so think about the human factors side of things, it could have a negative impact on safety because now it's reading more fuel. So I was thinking the same thing if I would have made the opposite mistake of set the fuel totalizer for the wrong amount and have the fuel totalizer tell me that there's 10 gallons of fuel remaining when really the tanks are close to being empty. All right, so this goes into, so about 1 month before the accident, the pilot had instructed the fixed-base software, the FBO operator in Camden to put 25 gallons of fuel in each tank. However, it's unknown how much fuel was already on board the airplane. Although the fuel totalizer showed that the plane had 123 gallons of fuel remaining at the time of crash, the fuel totalizer is based on pilot inputs, as we were just talking about. It's not based on aircraft inputs. So that fuel totalizer was wrong. And it caused that pilot to basically ignore a potential fuel exhaustion event and turn into a fatal accident. So our lessons learned here, regular fuel checks. So monitor your fuel quantity and consumption closely. You can do that in flight, and more importantly, do it after flight. So I try to be very disciplined, especially when I'm flying a plane that's unfamiliar to me, to keep a good fuel log. Figure out how much fuel went into each wing, and then I use ForeFlight to estimate my fuel burn. So in other words, I'll fly from point A to point B with a known fuel quantity. I'll refill to that known fuel quantity, and I'll figure out, did ForeFlight predict this correctly? And I try to get myself within 2 gallons, which I can reliably do in ForeFlight. If I have the POH and I run by the numbers, I can usually get within 2 gallons of estimate. And if I'm off more than that, then I start digging a little deeper, figuring out, well, what went wrong? Were my winds higher than forecast? Did I get an extra vector somewhere? Or is this fuel profile that my friend that signed me off on this airplane, am I burning more fuel than I thought I was? And then I have to, figure out why I was doing that. Is that because I mismanaged my mixture? Was that because I flew a higher power setting? Y'all are pilots, y'all can understand this, but don't just do the surface level of, as you're going in to grab the cup of coffee or to get the crew car, telling the line guy to fill her up, and then you come back and run the credit card and say everything's hunky-dory. You might be papering over a really bad problem that is only going to come to light when you're in flight and you have a lot less options. Understanding fuel systems, so really familiarize yourself with the layout and operation of those fuel systems. Don't underestimate the complexity of a fuel system. Even if it seems relatively simple, don't underestimate that. It's one of the most important systems that you know how to operate on the airplane. And then be ready to respond to fuel-related issues. So always try to keep tabs on what tank do I know has fuel in it. You can kind of run through these tabletop drills with your instructor of, okay, I've got a hesitation of power. Where's the fuel selector? Can I find it with my eyes closed? That's a good drill to do, is can you find the fuel selector with your eyes closed, and can you select a different tank? That may be critical to avoid a fuel starvation event. And then if you're with an experienced CFI, and I say experienced, and you've mitigated the risks, and you know the airplane, go up and experience a fuel starvation event. And that may be a little risque for some of my FAA people here, but I do believe that the risk is worth the reward if you're mitigating the risks appropriately with an experienced CFI in a safe place where you could put the plane down on pavement, on a runway, if for some reason you don't get the engine back. But I think it's important for us single engine pilots to realize what an engine failure or a fuel exhaustion event looks like, rather than just train it. And you can do this by pulling the mixture. I've done it on constant speed, and I've done it in fixed pitch propeller aircraft. Again, I think you can mitigate this risk. Talk to an experienced CFI. Don't go out and do this by yourself. But I think you'll be shocked by how working a dead engine looks like. And we train this in multi-engine world. And this is how I came to this, is I was primarily MEI. Most of my dual given has been in twin engine aircraft. And part of the twin engine check ride and part of the twin engine training is we shut down engines, and we shut them down all the time. I've shut down hundreds and hundreds of engines in flight and restarted hundreds and hundreds of engines. About 2,000 hours of dual given in multi-engine aircraft. I've had 3 instances where the engine didn't restart in training, and that was from a full feathered shutdown. I have never had an engine not restart from a windmilling instance. That's never happened. So what brought me to it is we're doing this engine failure practice in a twin, and in multi-engine training, it's really important to show the student that a dead engine is actually hard to identify. In fact, it's so hard we can't trust any of our gauges. We have to do the whole dead foot, dead engine, right? If you're a multi-engine pilot, you've heard that. It's been beaten into your skull, hopefully. Hold heading, control the aircraft, identify dead foot, dead engine, verify with the throttle, and then secure the engine. Only after I've identified it with the throttle. And I got to think, well, we don't ever do anything like that in a single engine aircraft. There's no requirement from the ACS, there's no requirement in the airplane flying handbook to go out and shut down an engine, identify that it is in fact failed, and then secure it. We just simulate it by pulling the throttle. And if you ask an instructor, and there's some humorous videos out there online, of course instructors, they video everything right now, so you can go out on YouTube and you can find events, and you can find people on Reddit that absolutely lose their mind when their student accidentally pulled the mixture. And they're like, it's like a near-death experience. They're like, my student pulled the mixture in flight, we almost died. They were going to shut down the engine. And I'm just thinking, I learned to fly in the late 90s at Russellville, and we had a local instructor. Again, this isn't proper risk management, but that's how he did engine failures. He pulled the mixture every time. He'd pull the mixture, he'd make you land in a farmer's road, right in between 2 rice fields. Now, that's where the risk isn't quite worth the reward, right? We're introducing a lot of risk to training that's probably not going to pay off. Now, that's great training, don't get me wrong. But you're more likely to injure somebody in training if you're doing that regularly. So, no, the engine isn't going to stop and never start if you pull the mixture in flight. But what it will do is it'll show you what an actual failed engine looks like. A fuel starvation event can be very confusing. And so I think it's useful to bring over some of that multi-engine training If you have a power hesitation in your single engine aircraft, move the throttle back and forth. Is the throttle responsive? If the throttle is not responsive, more than likely you have an engine failure. Because what's going to happen is that engine's out there still windmilling, right? My fuel pump's still pumping, my oil pump is still causing oil pressure, I still have oil temperature, I have manifold pressure, I've got RPM. The only thing that's dropped to zero if my engine's actually dead is EGT, and some planes don't even have an EGT. And if they do have an EGT, it's probably the smallest gauge that we look at the least. Right, so now we've got a failed engine, move that throttle back and forth. Is it actually dead? Yeah, okay, we've got a problem. Let me select a different tank. Let me verify the mixture position. Let me go through those troubleshooting steps. What's happened in a couple of these case studies, not the ones that we've looked at tonight, but others, of a pilot not recognizing that they have an actual engine failure. They think they have a partial engine failure because they've got full throttle, but they're only making 1,200 RPMs. And in their mind, they're thinking, well, a dead engine would be 0 RPMs. So that's dead. I've got 1,200. I don't have an engine failure. I don't need to go to best glide. I have a partial engine failure. I'm going to try to fly to the airport. And they get below best glide, and they stall spin it because they didn't know they had a full engine failure. Again, just speculating on my part, because unfortunately we can't interview these pilots to see what they were thinking at the time of the accident, because a lot of times it's a fatal accident. One last anecdote, and I'll take a question there. There was an M35. I bring this plane up a lot because I'm a Beechcraft guy. I give a lot of instruction, and the ABS has identified the M35 series as one of the worst planes when it comes to kind of fuel starvation events. There's a lot of them for this plane. But one where the pilot and the instructor both survived, and they said in the NTSB report that they didn't use the term engine failure. They said a loss of engine performance, and they had to do a forced landing. They wound up doing a forced landing, they trashed the airplane, they walked away, but they never said in the report that they had an engine failure. They just said the plane was suddenly unable to climb, which tells me that they probably didn't realize they had an engine failure. They had fuel starvation for sure. That engine wasn't producing power. They didn't recognize it as that though. They just said, oh, we weren't able to climb anymore and we had to do a forced landing. Wonder if that's because there was no fuel getting to the engine. So, all right, I think that's that. There's your key takeaways, and I'll leave that up and open it up for questions. Yeah, in the back. So the question was, how much RPM are you going to have if you're in a fixed pitch aircraft like a Piper? Let's say you're in a Cherokee 180 or a Warrior or something that's fixed pitch, direct drive engine. If you have an engine failure, how much RPMs are you going to have? The answer is it depends. If you're in a descent, it's going to be over 1,000 RPMs, in my experience. If you're straight and level and you're trying to maintain level flight, the RPMs are probably going to decay below around 800. They're going to be somewhere between 500 and 800, but the prop won't stop unless you get it really slow. It can stop if you approach stall, and what's happening is the windmilling force is causing the propeller to turn. So instead of a gas-operated engine, we have a gravity-operated engine because our engine hasn't ceased operation. Our engine has ceased the production of power. It's still operating. It's just like a rubber band airplane. If you blow on the end of a rubber band airplane, the propeller turns and the rubber band twists up, right? It's operating, but it's not producing power. So that's exactly what's happening in our aircraft, is the propeller still turning, engine's still operating, it's just no longer producing power. Yes, sir. So the question is, if you bought a fuel stick, basically a fuel quantity gauge, the physical one that you put in the fuel tank and measure, would it work in all Cherokee 140s or all Cherokees? I don't know. I think it would. Okay. I would assume what I know about the Cherokee is it's a mass-produced airplane, so they're pretty uniform versus some of the other aircraft that are all kind of built by hand and maybe a little different. I'm thinking of Beechcraft because they're serialized. So if you purchase a stick and it has an effective serial number like I would expect it to, So, and it's not just some wooden dowel that somebody made up in the hangar, which I've seen, you know. But yeah, if it's serialized, then it's only valid for those serial numbered aircraft. But if, you know, sometimes it might say, hey, it'll fit all of them. So yeah, and that's good that you're doing that. But remember, if you have a bladder failure somewhere in that bladder, it's going to tell you how much fuel is there that it thinks is there, right? But if the bladder has collapsed somewhere, it will give an inaccurate reading. So really the only way to tell if your bladder has collapsed is to get the tank empty, which obviously you wouldn't want to fly it that way, right? You'd want to fly it until you have about 30 minutes of fuel, land and drain out the rest. You could also borescope it, again, with the supervision of a knowledgeable AMT on what equipment to use with fuel in there. That still might not be safe. Please don't do that unless you know what you're doing. But drain all the fuel out and fill it up. If it takes 20 gallons and it's supposed to be a 20-gallon tank, hey, you're good to go. But if you drain it and you only put 15 gallons in there, you got a problem. Your bladder has collapsed somewhere. Oh, I didn't know that, actually. Okay. So some fuel selectors rely on cork. And I have a 1939 Taylorcraft that I love to fly, and it has a cork on a stick, and that's the fuel gauge. It sits in front of you. There's only one tank. And the little metal rod floats up on the end of that cork. And the cork floats on top of the fuel, like you're saying. So that cork can fail. Also, that little stick, it's literally just a metal rod through the fuel cap. It has also stuck on me, where that stick no longer goes through because it'll get a little bit of debris in there and hold it in place. So you're flying along, you're like, hey, this Taylorcraft didn't use any fuel today. That's great. Lucky me. It's using fuel, it's just not letting you know. So yeah, those corks can fail, just like a carb float, right? Carbureted aircraft rely on floats, and that float can fail, and when that float fails, that's a failure mode of carbureted aircraft. So that could actually cause an engine failure. So yeah, the cork failing in the fuel sending unit, even though it's a physical fuel sending unit, that would be something to check during annual. You know, a knowledgeable AMT should be able to check that. Luckily, corks are pretty easy to replace, you know, so that's good. Oh, good question. You got enough. Constant speed? Yeah. So the question is, if you're in a constant speed aircraft and you experience a non-catastrophic engine failure, which means the engine is still operating, it's just not producing power, what do I do with my prop lever? And throttle. So throttle in a constant speed, even most of these are fuel injected for the most part. Some of them aren't. But your throttle is controlling a plate. We're going to get in a little bit of how engines work here. This is great. I love engines. So engines are just big air compressors, right? And or a vacuum cleaner, which is just an air compressor. So if you think of you're vacuuming the floor and you hit the dog toy or something and it clogs the vacuum and you get this really high suction, that's a high vacuum. Not much air is moving through that vacuum cleaner anymore. It has a high level of suction. So if you could imagine your tiny little self inside the vacuum, you would be experiencing a lot of vacuum. Meanwhile, if you unclog the vacuum cleaner, the pitch goes down and a lot of air starts moving through the vacuum cleaner. That's a low vacuum state. So if you're looking at a manifold pressure gauge, that's a vacuum indicator. So the lower that manifold pressure, there's a higher vacuum in your engine, meaning less air is moving through it, meaning you're making less power. If you go out to an airplane that has a manifold pressure gauge and the engine is off, look at the manifold pressure gauge. What does it read? Atmospheric. There's air not moving through it, but there's no vacuum in it. But just think about the implications of that. A static engine with a manifold pressure gauge is reading full power on the manifold pressure gauge. That right there should show you how confusing a dead engine could look. Because a static engine is sitting there saying that you're making full power and the engine is off. right? So imagine you're going to see that in flight. So that's why the throttle is important if you have a dead engine because of a engine starvation. You want to remove any hindrance from that propeller moving. And if you close that throttle plate, you're creating a vacuum in the engine, and the propeller isn't able to windmill as fast as it normally would, and it would cause drag. So that's why we're going to go full power. We're not getting any power, but we're removing resistance for that propeller to move. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to pull the propeller lever all the way back, and that's going to force oil into that hub. As long as the engine's operating, the oil pump's still working, right? And it's going to force that propeller pitch to a higher pitch, and it's going to slow the rotation and remove a lot of drag and extend our glide range. And that might be a good thing, but that also might be a bad thing. But the really important thing is to know when to use that, because that becomes an energy management technique, right? So if I'm right above the runway and I want to land, I'm not going to do that. I want the prop full forward, and I want it to create a lot of drag so I can descend down and I can make my landing point. If the airport's 6 miles away, yeah, I want to pull that back and I want to extend my glide so I can arrive at the airport with as much energy as necessary to make a safe landing. So that's how personally I would manage that, a fuel starvation event on a constant speed. Does that answer your question? And that's something we talk about in the American Medanza Society, and that's probably what happened to my friend Brant. Is I think, and the NTSB thinks, he did select a tank with fuel in it and the engine didn't restart. And that can be for a lot of different reasons. One, it can take some time to reintroduce fuel into that system because all those fuel lines are empty now. And if they're hot, you could have vapor lock that you have to overcome. There's a lot of adversity to overcome there on that, and it may not restart. I am warning you that could happen. In my experience, in pulling the mixture and starving starving the engine from fuel from the mixture control is a different mechanism than starving it from the tank. Right? That whole fuel selector system now is empty. You've introduced air, right? Have you ever primed any fluid system? Like if you've got a well house and your house is on well water, if you don't prime the lines, that well pump might not be able to overcome that, and it just turns into an air compressor and you've got terrible water pressure. You got to prime. So that's what's happening with a fuel selector starvation versus a mixture starvation. I think you still could have it in a carbureted system because you're removing more fuel from the lines there. And also it's about how long you let that happen. Because if you have an unexpected fuel starvation event, more than likely there's going to be a few seconds for you to identify that and recover from it. And so now the clock is ticking and you've gone seconds and seconds with that thing shut down and introduced a lot of air into this fluid system versus if you just pull the mixture. So again, the way that I would recommend doing this, and I've got a YouTube video on my VSL channel where I did this in Conway in a fuel injected aircraft, reduce the power back to idle slowly, and then pull the mixture. So you're already at idle, pull the mixture, you'll be able to hear a slight frequency change as the engine stops producing power, move the throttle to verify the throttle is not responsive, pull it back to idle, reintroduce mixture, the engine will come back. Again, I've done that literally thousands of times in twin engine aircraft, both fuel injected and carbureted, and I've never had an instance where it doesn't come back. I'm not advocating that you just go out there and do this by yourself. If you're not comfortable with it, watch the video and you get just as much from it. You get some. I think it will have an indelible impact if you do this in the plane with a knowledgeable CFI. But just me up here telling you that, hey, you may not recognize that you have an engine failure due to fuel starvation. That's useful. I don't hear enough people saying that. There's a lot of pilots that don't realize that they could overlook a failed engine. They just had never even crossed their minds that they could have an engine failure and not know about it. I don't believe so. Yeah, the way I personally in an older aircraft, the checklists are deficient here on troubleshooting fuel pumps. Because there's aircraft that I've flown that really don't mention how to operate the fuel pump other than to say it needs to be on for takeoff and landing. Well, if you don't turn that fuel pump on with the engine off, you don't know that it's working. Does that make sense? Because the engine-driven fuel pump is going to hide any problems you have with your electrically driven fuel pump. So that's the biggest failure mode that I see people unintentionally introduce to their aircraft, is they start the aircraft up without ever having turned on the electrically driven fuel pump, and then they might turn it off during their takeoff, before takeoff checklist. They'll turn the fuel pump off, but all that tells you is that your mechanical fuel pump is working. It doesn't tell you that your electric fuel pump isn't working. So the only way to test that is to turn off your engine-driven fuel pump. The only way to turn off your engine-driven fuel pump is to turn off the engine. So, logically, you got to test that fuel pump before you start the engine to verify that it's working. So that's one thing that I would say. I do that in all aircraft that I fly that are different. I'll turn on the electric fuel pump on the ground just to verify that it's working. And then some aircraft have a single fuel pump with two different settings. So you'll have a low setting and a high setting, or a normal setting and emergency setting. That kind of varies depending on the manufacturer. So that's another thing to look, is you might have a 2-speed system, in which case you'd want to check both speeds and then verify, hey, do I need to take off in low or high or norm, how that operates. Good question though. All right, thank you so much for your time. It's right at 8:05. Yes, Jamie. Yeah, please sign the registration if you didn't sign up on there. Thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Hope to see you next month. I think Adam in the back, I'll put him on the spot. He's going to be doing next month's dinner, but hope to see y'all then. Thanks so much for coming out.